Chapter 7. When Dan and Gustavo walked into the department of the social services where Mrs. Stevens worked, they were taken aback by the many people sitting at tiny desks and practically hidden behind heaps of paper and files of all sorts. One or two of these people had word processors with large monitors occupying half the remaining space on each of their work tables. "Amazing," Dan whispered into Gustavo's ear. "I never imagined the social services being so busy." "Ah, there you are," Mrs. Stevens said, appearing at Dan's side unexpectedly. "Let's go to our interview room. We'll be more comfortable there, shall we?" "Do you mind if I attend the meeting too?" Gustavo asked timidly. "If Mr. Damianos has no objection." That's all Mrs. Stevens had to say for Dan to flare. "I've told you on the phone my name is Mr. Dan Politano, so, if you don't mind." "We'll see about that, sir," Mrs. Stevens snapped back, opening the door of the interview room. "Please come in and have a seat." Her tone was harsh and unyielding. Once Dan and Gustavo were seated across from Mrs. Stevens, she began. "So you say you are Mr. Dan Politano, is that correct?" "Yes, that's what I found out yesterday when I went to the Naval Base and examined my enrollment file," Dan replied, putting the folder he had brought with him on the table. "Are these copies of your enrollment papers?" Mrs. Stevens pointed to the file. Dan pushed it toward her. "Yes, it contains copies of my birth certificate and a copy of my photo, plus all the forms I had to fill out at the time I filed my application." She opened it and put her glasses back on the bridge of her nose and began examining every sheet of paper carefully. "May I keep the file?" she asked. "Yes, I have no objection," Dan said, shrugging. "For now I have a question for you, Mrs. Stevens. Would you be able to tell me if I had taken up residence in Key West since my enrollment?" "I should have thought that since you had now identified yourself conclusively, at least as far as you're concerned, you would have been able to find that out for yourself." "Okay then," Dan said, getting up. "Let's go, Gustavo. Since I will have to find out the rest of my story on my own, I don't think we need to detain Mrs. Stevens any longer, do you?" "Wait a moment, Mr. Politano, you can't just leave." "And why not? I've just given you all the proof you need to close my case file and let me resume my life. That's all we have to discuss, isn't it?" "Except for a little matter of reimbursing this office for the hotel expense. You mean the shelter expenses, don't you, Mrs. Stevens?" "Well, yes, but whatever you wish to call it, there's still a night unaccounted for." "I think you are mistaken, Mrs. Stevens. You see, you did not acknowledge my name or my identity until a few minutes ago, so I think that last night at the shelter is still on you, isn't it?" "Who says I didn't accept your identity until this morning?" "I do," Gustavo cut in. "I've heard you call my friend Mr. Damianos a few minutes ago, and I'll testify about it in court if need be." All right, Mrs. Stevens said, rising to her feet and taking the file with her. "But be sure to vacate your room by tonight, Mr. Politano, or what, Mrs. Stevens? Are you going to kick me out?" "I'll be sure to pay my bill personally and sue you for wrongful eviction under false pretense if you attempt to chase me out of the shelter." "But how are you going to pay for it? You're not working." "Listen, Mrs. Stevens," Dan had enough. "I appreciate what you've done for me when I came out of the hospital, but now I suggest you stay well away from me, okay?" And without another word, Dan marched out of the interview room, Gustavo in tow. Having deposited the spaghetti, sauce and salad bowls on the dining room table, Solangi raised her voice to say, "Dinner is served," looking at her guest with a broad grin appearing on her lips. "Smells delicious," Malou said, taking a seat to Solangi's right. "We didn't see anyone setting the table. Did you do that magically?" Daniel piped up, sitting down beside his mother. "Oh no, Daniel. No magic tricks in this house. I simply set it before you came in, that's all." The plates, glasses and cutlery were all a reflection of another era. Their fine design and the exquisite, almost transparent porcelain of the plates gave one the impression of being dining in one of the finest European houses. "These are beautiful," Gabby said, taking her salad fork gingerly and admiring the delicate silver engravings. "I bet they cost a mint." "I'll have to wash his mouth with some soap one of these days," Malou thought, but said nothing. "Actually, Daniel, they were wedding presents when Damien and I were married," Solangi said, throwing a quirky smile in the young man's direction. "But we're not here to discuss the price of my china, so just help yourselves." Malou took the salad bowl and after serving Solangi passed it around to her children. Stefano took the opportunity to pour a glass of red wine for everyone around the table. Gabby looked at her mother before accepting to have a glass. Solangi had to smile. "If you wish, I have some juice in the fridge," she offered. "That's fine, Miss Solangi. I think Dad wouldn't mind if I had a glass with dinner." "I'm sure you're right, dear. Besides, wine is good for you. If you don't drink too much of it, of course." She looked around the table. "Oh my, I forgot the bread," she exclaimed suddenly. Gabby was up already. "Where is it? I'll get it." "In the oven, dear, and there's a bread basket on the counter. Thank you." The conversation during dinner turned rapidly to Solangi's life and her travel adventures with Damien. "And you know, nothing could really stop us," she remarked. When Damien had some time to spare, he would organise a trip for us. I generally kept a suitcase packed, just in case. She giggled at the recollection. But I was usually wrong. One time we went to Africa, and all I had packed were winter outfits. Did you have to buy anything while you were there then? Malou asked, imagining how she would fare if she had to buy any sort of clothes in the markets of an African town. Oh yes, at first it wasn't easy, but I got used to these surprise expeditions eventually. Which country did you particularly enjoy visiting? Stefano asked, between mouthfuls of spaghettis. I think Australia was the most intriguing to me. Why? Daniel asked. Did you see any kangaroos? Solangi laughed outright this time. We saw kangaroos and wallabies and koalas and all sorts of strange animals, yes. But they were not what remained etched in my memory. It was the age of the continent, which was evident everywhere, that retained my attention. Did you meet any Aboriginal people? Gabby queried. Oh yes, most intriguing people indeed. You see, according to some scientific studies, they are the oldest humans on Earth. And if I had to differentiate colours between races, Australian Aboriginals are, in my opinion, the blackest people on the planet. I couldn't believe it when I saw them for the first time. Even the darkest African person literally pales in comparison. They apparently live off the land pretty well, don't they? Malou remarked. Yes, they do. But when the white man introduced alcohol to their tribes, it was the end of their natural and ancestral mode of living. They became despondent and restless. Being illiterate, they were treated extremely badly by the people who came to Australia over the last 2 centuries. As Dan and Gustavo made their way back to the shelter, they passed by a clothing shop. Somehow the shop window retained Dan's attention. He stopped and turned to look at the mannequins outfitted with various apparels. Did they remind you of something? Gustavo asked, looking up at the display. Not really, but there's something about that summer dress that triggered an image in my mind. It looks the same as I saw in a woman. I don't know. Dan shook his head and resumed walking. It's like snapshots appear and disappear in front of my eyes, and I can't place the people or the event. It's very strange. Why don't we go back to the park where they found you? Gustavo suggested. Maybe you'll remember what happened, and it might tell you what you were doing to fall like you did. That's a good idea, but I should really phone my parents just to say hello. Do you think they'll be annoyed if I call collect? Why should they? You might not have the change in your pocket, or if you were travelling, it would be expected for you to call collect. I don't see the problem. I guess you're right, Dan agreed. Yet he was still in 2 minds about making the call. He didn't want to have his parents worrying about him. Why don't we go to the coffee shop beside the shelter and you place the call from there? Why not from the shelter? Dan asked, raising a questioning eyebrow. I don't know, but I've got a hunch that old Harrison is keeping an eye on you for some reason, and I don't know why he would, but he's a sneaky bastard if you ask me. Okay then, let's use the phone at the coffee shop. As they entered the little cafe, it was nearly empty. Only 2 young people were sharing a piece of pie facing each other across the table. Lovebirds, Gustavo remarked, whispering in Dan's ear as they took a seat in a booth close to the payphone. Do you think I've got a girlfriend? Dan asked out of the blue. Gustavo chortled. Don't know, man. If you had, I'd say that would be one of the first things you'd remember. Girls have a way to leave a deep impression on your mind. I suppose so, Dan replied pensively. You see, Gustavo, the people I knew before the accident... He stopped in mid-sentence. What accident? Gustavo was quick to ask, hoping to help Dan retain the snippet of memory that seemed to have passed in front of his eyes just now. I fell and hit my head. I was skiing. Dan said evasively. Sorry, it's gone. I'm sure that didn't happen out here, though. No skiing in these parts. It wasn't here. Of that I'm sure, and I was older. Maybe it was somebody else. I don't know. Or maybe your parents could tell you. Dan shook his head. No, I'm going to talk to my mum about anything like an accident when I don't even know if it happened to me or to someone else. Are you going to have something to eat or just coffee? The owner asked as he came around the counter and approached the table. Just coffee, man, thanks, Gustavo replied quickly, before looking at Dan. Do you want to eat something? No thanks, not for now, maybe later, Dan said, throwing a glance at the owner. The burly man didn't seem too pleased with that answer. Coffee coming right up, he said, walking away with a shrug. Once the 2 coffees were in front of them, Dan got up and went to the phone. He pulled a piece of paper on which he had written his parents' number out of his jeans pocket and dialed the operator. After a few interminable seconds, he finally got connected. He recognised his mother's voice instantly. Hey, Mum, how are you? Goodness gracious, Dan. Where were you? I called your apartment and got no answer for the past 2 days. Dad and I were getting worried. Why didn't you call on Sunday?" Dan could only smile. Truly, he didn't know what to say or how to explain his situation. Not that he wanted to anyway. "I'm fine, Mum. I just stayed with a friend over the weekend and they didn't have a phone at their cabin," he lied. "But here I am, and I'm fine." "Well, next time you decide to go travelling, just let us know, will you?" Yes, of course." Dan paused. He wondered how he was going to ask for his address in Key West, since it appeared that he must have an apartment somewhere in town. "Well, anything happening with you guys?" "Nothing much, dear. Just that your dad has got it in his head to get a pool installed in the backyard." "A pool? What on earth for? We're 5 minutes from the ocean." "He says it's getting too hot around here." "Okay, well, if that's what he wants to do." "Yes, I know, dear, but it's going to take all the space." "Don't worry about it, Mum. I'm sure Dad will think of everything." A few words later, Dan hung up, tears purling at the rim of his eyes. He couldn't even remember his own home.